believe he created a framework where that's really true. So I'll show you why I believe that. And I also just know as a practitioner that I'm always anxious in every situation about whether it'll work or not. And so that is, it's not a freedom from, worrying, but it certainly has been a framework which has been almost perfect for my experience, which started in 1984. So there's, and the Lewin's whole intent, Kurt Lewin's, was that these methods be transferable, not just to, well, there were no OD people, but to anybody facing problems and trying to solve them. So let me bring up the slides. And my father, who intended to be here and still may show up if we are lucky, is there to my right. He first was in a T group, which was a method invented by Kurt Lewin in 1953, just 6 years after Kurt Lewin passed away. And he then was with Ron Lippitt, who was one of Lewin's close associates. For almost 30 years, he was mentored by this person, Ron Lippitt. And you can see some of the various books that we've written. You have the first chapter from this book, and you have my father's entire book, I believe. And so this particular book, Plan Change, came out of a series of critiques of Lewin. I kept hearing people say things and write things like his change model is too simple. And so I started to challenge some of that. And when I did so, I started reading Lewin's writing. And I realized that I had not really done so. Here I had been using his methods for 30 years, and I hadn't really studied his writing. And so this, my intent was, once I did that, was to organize it in a way that would make it more accessible to people. So that's really what this Plan Change book is about. So a little background, Kurt Lewin was born in Mogilno, which was a portion of Prussia at the time. Now it's part of Poland. He was a Jewish male living in really what was the Kaiser's Germany. And so even before Hitler and the Nazis came to power, he faced institutional racism that was law. So for instance, he taught at the University of Berlin and was not allowed to become a tenured professor because he was Jewish. It was against the law. It was against the law for Jewish people to own land. They had to find somebody else to own the land and hold the deed, then they could work it, but they weren't allowed to own it. So he faced various types of powerlessness. And so power and powerlessness was one of the sociological phenomenons that was very important to him as he put together his social science. And so there's more to come on that. So Lewin was radical at the time, back in the 1920s, 1930s in Berlin, and then he moved to the United States in the mid-1930s to escape Nazism. He was radical in saying, look, you can have science, use physical science methods. You can apply them to psychology. You can apply them to sociology. You can apply them to understanding group behavior. And it had never been done. So he took a simple process like plan, do, and assess, or in this case, fact finding. He took this simple process of steps and help people apply it to social issues and to performance improvement in organizations. And so any like process improvement, you can take it back to a couple sources, but certainly Lewin was one of the important sources. Now, part of what he believed based on experiments, he always was doing research, but he believed research should always be addressing real issues. So he called it action research. He thought that research that was just purely for knowledge but wasn't applied to real world issues was, in a sense, a waste of effort, because there are plenty of real world issues for us to address. And also he wanted to test theory in the actual world versus just having it be theory. So action research is what his methods came to be known as, but he called it training action research, because every time he did an intervention, training was part of the intervention. He would help people learn how to think differently about what they were facing and to talk to each other differently. And so be able to have dialogue even when they had differences. So there was always the three elements for him. And then you repeat. You go through the process, and it was a never-ending spiral, as he put it. So of particular importance then, applying the physical sciences, was the concept of homeostasis. In Lewin's social science, every system is in homeostasis. You have forces which are holding it in place. There's forces that are pushing it, but there's forces that are pulling it back. And so what people tend to do to try to change organizations is they will, let's say if they want more performance, they'll press for more performance. They will maybe add incentives to hopefully get more performance. So that's the carrot. They might add a stick. They might be more stern with the employees and try to get more performance. And so that increases tension in the system, and it can't be sustained. If you just drive and push, tension goes up. Eventually, the tension erodes the gains, in his way of thinking. So instead, what Lewin would have people do in all kinds of different circumstances is identify what's holding things back, to have a group dialogue about what he called the restraining forces. And so now he was a clever guy, because as soon as you have people who have not been invited to talk about what's happening, like workers in a plant, as soon as you actually say to them, look, you get to talk about what's working and not working, you get to help come up with solutions, you have already changed the homeostasis. You are already removing or weakening a restraining force, which in most places is that only the experts and only the management people are trying to do all the thinking and come up with the solutions. So there's a gap between who's thinking and who's doing. And that is a restraining force unto itself. So we will have time to talk about maybe some of your own situations, and I'm going to give some examples from our work. Dad was very excited to give some of these examples, so I feel sad that he's not here with us. At least I don't think he is. So, but there's many ways to make an impact on restraint. So I will say one, the very first thing I did with my father when I was only 24 years old, back in 1984, There was a city, the city we lived in, the city of Spokane, and there was a big conflict about what to do with the downtown portion of the city, which was a park and had been used for the World's Fair in 1974. And so there was this land there, and there was a dispute about what to do about it. And it was a bitter dispute. The park board was just, they didn't know how to deal with the angry citizens. There were citizens who thought that it was a plot to turn the whole thing into a theme park, and that the park board had already decided, and the mayor had decided, and it was all already decided, and it was evil. And so they were angry. So the meetings were just people shouting. So Dad went into these meetings. He got hired to help somehow change the dynamics. And I just went along to help, carry pins and stuff for him and watch what happens and see if I could learn something. So what he did was he first let people shout some for each meeting. They'd shout for about 30 minutes, take turns shouting at him. They thought he was also part of the secret plot. Then he would get them into groups to work on different alternatives for the future of the park. And so every meeting, they'd start with shouting, and then soon they would get to work. And then they would come, what they did was they came up with 5 alternatives, and then we went out and got citizens to vote on the alternatives. And, sort of fortunate, there was an alternative that had a theme park. It didn't get voted on. People wanted it to be more like a green space. But instead of, he reduced the restraining force of mistrust by allowing people to engage in a process that was structured so they could influence the future. And it broke the deadlock, and the park is still that way now in 2021. It was designed that way back in 1984, and it has stuck. So one thing Lewin knew was you get the people in the room who are upset. You don't try to fix it without them. If at all possible, if you're working with workers and some of them are the most upset workers, get them involved in the conversation and coming up with solutions. So that's just one example of unfreezing, as Lewin put it, the homeostasis. But when people look at this model and say it's too simple, they aren't aware of the group dynamic methods that go with it. Even what was meant by unfreeze, which of course, if you're trying to change something, you're trying to get it to be different. That's all. So unfreeze the homeostasis, shift, and if at all possible, you're doing this with group dynamics, you've already started the change. As a matter of fact, you've already got to the new homeostasis. In a lot of the work I do, as soon as the people in the group really have a chance to influence, they've already created a new and more productive homeostasis. As soon as they've begun, the change has already started to occur that's most important. So it doesn't have to be a long process. I'll give you some more examples, but first, we're almost through the slides, so we're going to have plenty of time to interact and chat here. Every time Lewin worked, he made it into a research activity. And so the US government wanted him to help many times. Once he was in the US and they realized what this guy could do, they wanted his help. For instance, we were going through the Dust Bowl years in the Midwest, so it was terrible drought. And the US government wanted the farmers to use different methods of irrigation, to be able to farm with less water. So they sent people in trains out to the Midwest. This is the late 1930s, and the US government people came out and lectured to the farmers. And almost nothing got done as a result of the lectures. And this was a consistent truth for Lewin around group dynamics. So he went out there and he would have the same lecturer work with one group. Go ahead, lecture with this group. Let's track how that goes. And then now you're going to give a little bit of information to this group, but this group of farmers is going to talk amongst themselves about what they think of the recommendations from the government, about their own ideas, about how to modify the recommendations from the government, and come up with a group decision, is how he put it. It didn't necessarily mean that they voted. There was no formal authority in a group like that. But they said, okay, I'm going to do this. And other people committed to the same kind of action. It's a commitment that comes from peer dialogue. And then they would go out and get it done to a high degree of implementation. If people are allowed to come up with solutions, they are much more likely to implement them successfully than if they are forced to follow somebody else's solutions. So the group dynamics and the unfreezing is to allow people to have to think for themselves to the extent possible. So this particular graphic then is around the government attempting to get mothers to use milk differently during World War II. And same result. If they just got lectured at, very little influence on the individuals. If they were allowed to have dialogue and come up with their own nuances and plans, high implementation success. Same thing true in a factory. Lewin worked really, this went on for like 30 years in this place called Harwood Manufacturing, because the owner was so happy with the results, he kept it going even after Lewin's death in 1947. Groups that were allowed to talk about how the work, what was holding the work back, what would make it go smoother, and experiment, were able to increase their productivity and their morale and decrease conflict. And the rest of the groups stayed pretty much the way they were if they didn't have that kind of intervention. So Lewin famously, at least it's famous to me, came up with this formula. He was very creative. Science is not about having the final answer. Science is about continuing to experiment. And so you learn things like what you're hearing today, and then you go out and experiment. And you don't have to do it exactly the way Lewin would have done it, or I would do it. It is a process of experimentation. And so he was constantly then experimenting with things like topography, which is map making, and applying that to sociology and psychology. And he was using physics and applying it to human psychology and behavior. And so this formula here, behavior is a function of personality and the environment, was radical again at the time. There was a big fight going on. Is it nature or is it nurture? Why do humans behave the way they do? Is it just because you're born this way, or is it because of the environment? And Lewin said it's both. Of course, it's both. And if, for instance, you have an organization where people are demoralized, it's not because they were born demoralized. There is something about the homeostasis in that organization which is causing demoralization. And it's going to be different in different individuals. Some will be more demoralized, some will be less. But the environment is a heavy influence, and you could shift it to where people are enjoying their work and having more energy and productivity. So you can change it the other way. You can change it either way. Most people don't want to change it on purpose to demoralization. That's unfortunately easy to accomplish by accident. But you can change it either way. So here's the last slide. This is getting back then to Lewin's social science being applied to power in society and in organizations. Forgive me if you get a little dizzy watching Mel Brooks go down into vertigo there. But in any organization or any society where there are power imbalances, then people are going to be on what Lewin called the margin. If, for instance, there's an imbalance in, like racism, for instance, if there's a belief in society that there's different races, which is a socially constructed belief, we could maybe talk about that some more, and then there's a restriction and so on, like in Germany, when Lewin could not be a tenured professor at the University of Berlin. Some of it's subtle, some of it's overt. Then the people, even the people who have power, are going to be a little crazy because they're going to wonder if they're doing the wrong thing. They're going to feel defensive at times. They're going to, there's various ways it confuses everybody. Nobody escapes the problem. And the people who don't have power are going to wish they had more access, of course. They wish they were more like the people that did have power. On the other hand, they don't like the group that has power. And on the other hand, they don't really wish they were part of the group that doesn't have power. And so it leaves you wondering things like, if you're a woman and you can't advance in the organization, and it just happens that no women ever have advanced in that organization, you may be wondering, is it just because of gender bias? Or is it that I personally need to somehow change my behavior or increase my skills? Is it me, or is it the environment? And it's going to be hard to ever know for sure. So sometimes when it is the environment, people are going to blame themselves. And other times when it is just them, they're just going to blame the environment. And so it creates all kinds of individual psychological issues if there are dysfunctions in the power, imbalances in society. So that was one reason why Lewin was determined to help, like the government had him work on race relations in Connecticut. And he did that by bringing people together, training them, bringing them together, having them figure out what they wanted to do in their communities. The same kind of approach. Unfortunately, that was 1946, and he passed away in early 1947. So that is a quick dip into Lewin's social science. So, Joseph, now my belief for group dynamics purposes that would be that it'd be wise now to have people get into pairs for a few minutes and just talk to a peer about, well, what sense are they making out of all of that? What kind of questions do they have? So this would be where I would do that.
Yeah, so you got the option.
Okay, we can do that randomly. So
yes,
let's proceed. So I'm going to put you into pairs in breakout rooms, and I choose pairs